A girl with no pedigree, no fortune. The words slipped from her lips like polished stones, smooth and cold. She wasn't shouting. She didn't have to. In a room draped in silk and smelling of old money, her whisper was a guillotine. Hardly the kind of wife my son deserves. She smiled at me then, a perfect blood-red smile, and I learned in that instant that some poisons don't need to be swallowed. They can be served on the air itself. That was my introduction to Margaret Dalton, my future mother-in-law. It was the first cut in a war of 1,000 paper cuts that nearly bled me dry. If you believe that the quietest people can harbor the strongest fire and that true justice is a life well lived, then you're going to want to see this through to the end. Do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't. You're not just a listener, you're a witness. And the story you're about to hear is a testament to the fact that you should never, ever underestimate the person you wronged. Part 1. The Gilded Cage. It all began, as so many tragedies do, with love. Or what I thought was love. Richard Dalton was charming, handsome, and carried the easy confidence of someone who had never wanted for anything. We met through mutual friends in the city, far from the suffocating orbit of his family. In those early days, he was my world. He saw me, a junior graphic designer with more ambition than experience, and made me feel like a masterpiece. Our dates weren't extravagant, but they were filled with laughter and a sense of shared discovery. He loved the little, unpretentious bistro I'd found. I loved the way he'd explain constellations on late-night walks through the park. For a year, we built a world that felt like it belonged only to us. Then came the inevitable summons. The first dinner at the Dalton estate. I remember pulling up the long, winding driveway, the crunch of gravel under the tires sounding like a warning. The house wasn't a house. It was a monument to a dynasty. Stone lions guarded the entrance, their faces locked in a permanent, silent roar. Richard squeezed my hand, but I could feel a film of sweat on his palm. "Just be yourself," he whispered, a phrase that is only ever uttered when being yourself is the last thing you should be. The air inside was different. Still, cool and scented with lilies and lemon polish. And there she was. Margaret Dalton. She was everything the house promised. Elegant, severe, and timeless. She was dressed in a simple navy blue dress that probably cost more than my car, a string of pearls glowing at her throat. Her hair was a perfect silver helmet, and her eyes, the same pale blue as her son's, surveyed me not as a person, but as an acquisition being considered for purchase. "So you're Catherine," she said, her voice smooth as cream. She didn't offer a hand, just a slight, regal nod. Richard's father, a quiet man named Arthur who seemed to be a permanent piece of the background furniture, just grunted a hello. The dinner was an exquisite torture. The dining room table was a vast expanse of polished mahogany, so long I felt like I needed binoculars to see Richard, who was seated opposite me, next to his mother. The clinking of sterling silver against porcelain was the only sound for long stretches. I tried to make conversation, talking about my work, a recent project I was proud of. Margaret listened with a detached curiosity, like a scientist studying an insect. "Graphic design," she mused, swirling the deep red wine in her glass. "How creative. Is there a great deal of security in that kind of craft?" The word craft was delivered with the faintest sneer, as if she were talking about my whittling skills. I tried to explain the growing industry, the digital landscape, but I could see her eyes glazing over. Then came the questions about my family. My father was a high school history teacher. My mother, a nurse. Good, honest, hardworking people who had taught me the value of kindness and integrity. "A teacher and a nurse," Margaret repeated, setting her wine glass down with a definitive click. It was then she delivered that first, perfect little blow. A girl with no pedigree, no fortune. Hardly the kind of wife my son deserves. She said it directly to me, but with that practiced smile that offered a paper-thin layer of plausible deniability. It was a joke, you see. "Can't you take a joke, dear?" I felt the blood rush to my cheeks, a hot, prickling wave of humiliation. I looked at Richard, my heart screaming for him to say something. To defend me. To say, "Mother, that's enough." Or even just to laugh it off in a way that included me, that showed her we were a team. He did nothing. He just cleared his throat and took a sudden, intense interest in his roasted duck. His silence was not just a lack of support, it was an endorsement. In that moment, the first crack appeared in the foundation of the world we had built. I realized I wasn't there as his partner. I was there as his choice on trial. And I was failing. The rest of the evening is a blur of similar moments. Her asking if my dress was a rental. Her complimenting my table manners in a way that implied she was surprised I had any. Every word was a tiny, sharp instrument, designed to find the softest parts of my confidence and press down. I felt myself shrinking in my chair, my posture curling inward as if to protect myself. The grand room, with its high ceilings and ancestral portraits staring down, felt like it was actively trying to suffocate me. When we finally left, the night air felt like a gasp of freedom. In the car, I was silent, the echo of her words ringing in my ears. "Well," Richard said, forcing a cheerful tone. "That wasn't so bad, was it?" I turned to look at him, to see the man I loved, and for the first time, I saw a stranger. A man who had just watched me get systematically dismantled, and was now trying to convince me it was a pleasant evening. "She hates me, Richard." "Don't be dramatic, Kate," he sighed, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. "That's just how she is. She's from a different generation. She just wants to make sure you're right for me, for the family. By telling me I'm not good enough for you?" My voice was trembling. "You're twisting her words. She has a dry sense of humor." It wasn't a dry sense of humor. It was cruelty wrapped in Chanel. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that this was only the beginning. Despite that disastrous evening, I married him. I loved him, and a foolish, naive part of me believed that once we were husband and wife, once I was officially a Dalton, things would change. I would prove my worth. I would win her over with patience and kindness. It was the greatest miscalculation of my life. Being a Dalton didn't make me one of them. It just gave Margaret a closer target. Our home, a generous wedding gift from his parents, never felt like mine. Margaret had a key. She would let herself in, rearranging furniture to her liking, replacing the art I'd chosen with pieces from their storage, which were invariably grim portraits of long-dead Daltons. "Just freshening things up, dear," she'd say. "This room needed a bit of history." My history, it was implied, wasn't worth displaying. Family gatherings were masterclasses in psychological warfare. At Christmas, she unwrapped the expensive cashmere scarf I'd spent weeks saving for. She held it up, felt the fabric between her fingers, and said, "How lovely. I'll have to see if the dry cleaner can get the synthetic feel out of it." She then turned to her daughter, Richard's sister, and praised her gift, a generic bottle of perfume, as if it were the most thoughtful present she'd ever received. She compared me, constantly and unfavorably, to Richard's ex-girlfriend, a woman from a rival good family. You know, Amelia had the most wonderful grasp of etiquette. She always knew which fork to use. Or, Amelia played tennis at the club. Such a healthy, appropriate hobby for a young woman. I tried to fight back in my own quiet way. I hosted a dinner party for Richard's friends, spending days planning the menu, perfecting every detail. I wanted to show them and myself that I could be a capable hostess, that I belonged. Margaret arrived early, swept through my kitchen with a critical eye, and then, in front of all my guests, insisted on helping me by replating the appetizers. "They just look a little clumsy, dear. Let me show you." She took over my kitchen, my party, and my evening, relegating me to the role of a hired hand in my own home. Through it all, Richard's weakness was a constant, throbbing ache in my heart. When I would confront him, his response was always the same. "You're too sensitive. You need to understand the pressure she's under. Just ignore her." "How can I ignore her?" I finally screamed at him one night, after a particularly brutal charity event where Margaret had introduced me to her friends as Richard's little project, when she is actively trying to erase me. "You're making a scene, Kate," he said, his voice cold, his back turned to me as he loosened his tie. "You're the one who can't seem to fit in. Maybe you should try harder." That was the moment the love finally died. It wasn't a sudden death, but a slow, painful starvation. I had been feeding it with hope and patience, and he had been feeding it nothing. I realized he hadn't married a partner. He had married a buffer, someone to absorb his mother's toxicity so he didn't have to. He wasn't living in her shadow. He was hiding there. and he had left me out in the cold. I looked around the beautiful, opulent house that had never felt like a home. I saw the grim-faced Dalton ancestors on the walls, their eyes seeming to judge me. I saw the life that was supposed to be mine, a life of luxurious emptiness, of constant, quiet humiliation. It was a gilded cage, and the door had been open all along. I just had to be brave enough to fly out. And in that cold, silent bedroom, with my husband refusing to even look at me, I knew my marriage wasn't just in trouble. It was already over. I just had to sign the papers.
Part 2. The Echo of a Slammed Door. The decision to leave was like stepping off a cliff in the dark. Terrifying, but also, in a strange way, a relief. There was nothing left to hold on to. The divorce proceedings were a cold, clinical affair. The Dalton family lawyers were efficient, brutal, and made it clear that I was to be excised from the family tree with surgical precision. I didn't fight for money. I didn't want a single, blood-soaked dollar of their fortune. I wanted my name back. My life. Myself. I took only what I had come with, my clothes, my books, and a bruised but still beating heart. Richard never fought for me. He never called to see if we could work it out. His only communication was through his attorney. It was as if our entire life together had been a business merger that had failed, and now he was simply liquidating the assets. The final, most cutting insult came not from him, but, of course, from Margaret. I was at my lawyer's office to sign the last of the papers. As I was leaving, my lawyer, a kind, weary woman named Susan, put a hand on my arm. "There's one more thing," she said, her expression hesitant. She slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a copy of a clause from their side. It stipulated that I was to sign a non-disclosure agreement of dizzying scope, forbidding me from ever speaking or writing about my time as a Dalton. "It's standard for families like this," Susan said gently. "But it's the justification they used that I thought you should see." She pointed to an internal memo that had been accidentally included in the file. It was a note from Margaret to the lead attorney. It read, "Ensure she is silenced. We cannot have a person of her background cheapening the family name with sordid tales." Cheapening the family name. I had spent years enduring her quiet, venomous attacks, trying to be graceful, trying to be worthy. And her final assessment was that I was the one who could cheapen them. The rage that filled me was so pure, so hot, it felt like it could melt steel. I signed the document without a word. My revenge would not be in words. It would be in deeds. But the most gleeful moment for Margaret, the one that would fuel me through countless lonely nights, was one I wasn't meant to witness. A few weeks after the divorce was finalized, I had to return to our old house to pick up a box of personal items the movers had missed. I had arranged it with the housekeeper, timing it for when I knew no one would be home. I let myself in the back door, the silence of the house a stark contrast to the emotional chaos it used to hold. The box was in the study. As I bent to pick it up, I heard voices from the living room. Margaret's voice, clear as a bell, followed by the sycophantic murmurs of her friends. I froze, my body going rigid. "It was for the best, of course," Margaret was saying, her tone light and triumphant. "Richard is so relieved. We all are. He can finally find someone suitable, someone from our world. I truly believe I saved the family name." There was a murmur of agreement. Then one of her friends, a woman with a voice like gravel, asked, "What will become of her? The little designer?" I heard the clink of a teacup against a saucer. Then Margaret's voice, dripping with dismissive pity. "Oh, who knows? People like that always land on their feet, I suppose. Or they don't. It's of no consequence to us anymore." No consequence. I backed out of the study, silent as a ghost, leaving the box behind. I slipped out the back door, my heart hammering against my ribs. I sat in my beat-up sedan at the end of that long, winding driveway, and for the first time since the split, I let myself break. The sobs came in ragged, ugly waves, a storm of grief not for the loss of my marriage, but for the loss of my own identity. I had let that woman, and her weak-willed son, convince me that I was small, that I was nothing, that I was of no consequence. That was my rock bottom. Sitting in a 10-year-old car, crying my eyes out, while the woman who had systematically destroyed my confidence celebrated her victory with tea and scones. The first few months were a gray blur. I found a small, soulless apartment on the other side of town. The walls were thin, the view was a brick wall, and the silence was deafening. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, my heart pounding with a nameless dread, the ghost of Margaret's condescending smile haunting my thoughts. I lost weight. I stopped talking to friends because I didn't know how to explain the depth of the humiliation without sounding pathetic. I was drowning. Everywhere I looked, I saw the Dalton name. On buildings, on charity sponsorships, in the society pages of the magazines at the grocery store checkout. It was a constant reminder of the world I had failed to conquer, the world that had chewed me up and spat me out. The turning point wasn't a lightning bolt. It was a flicker. I was staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror one morning, at the dark circles under my eyes, at the hollows in my cheeks. I looked defeated. I looked exactly like the person Margaret believed me to be. And the flicker of rage I'd felt in the lawyer's office returned, this time not as a fire, but as a pilot light. A tiny, steady flame in the darkness. No, I will not be of no consequence. That was the day I started to fight back. Not against them, but for myself. I threw myself into my work with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. I wasn't just a graphic designer anymore. I decided I would become an indispensable branding expert. I stayed late. I took online courses in market analysis and corporate strategy. I started freelancing on the side, building a portfolio, taking on small, unglamorous clients and treating them like they were Fortune 500 companies. Slowly, painfully, I began to rebuild. Each successfully completed project was a brick in a new foundation. Each piece of praise from a client was a balm on the wounds Margaret had inflicted. I learned to network, forcing myself to go to industry mixers. At first, it was agonizing. I'd stand in the corner, nursing a glass of cheap wine, feeling like an awkward teenager. I could still hear Margaret's voice in my head, critiquing my dress, my posture, my very presence. But I kept going. I learned to ask questions, to listen, to find common ground. I discovered that outside of the Daltons' rarefied air, my background wasn't a liability. It was a strength. I hadn't been raised with a silver spoon, so I knew the value of hard work. I hadn't been taught to rely on a family name, so I built my own reputation. My confidence, once a fragile thing, started to solidify. It wasn't the borrowed confidence of being Mrs. Dalton. It was my own, forged in fire and earned with sweat. 2 years after the divorce, I landed a senior strategist position at a top-tier marketing firm. It was a huge step up. The pay was good, the work was challenging, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of pride that was wholly mine. I bought a small condo in a vibrant neighborhood, filled it with art that I chose, and hosted dinner parties where the only voice that mattered was the one encouraging laughter and conversation. I was healing. I was becoming whole again. I rarely thought of the Daltons, and when I did, it was with a distant, clinical detachment. They were a chapter, a painful lesson, but the book of my life was still being written.
One of my firm's major clients was a philanthropic foundation that hosted an annual charity gala, one of the biggest events of the year. My boss insisted I attend. "You need to be seen, Kate," she said. "FaceTime with the big players." My stomach churned at the thought. Gala. A room full of the same kind of people who had watched Margaret humiliate me. The old panic, the feeling of being an imposter, threatened to surface. I almost didn't go. I had a dozen excuses lined up, a headache, a looming deadline, a sick friend. But as I stood in front of my closet, the pilot light inside me burned a little brighter. Hiding was letting her win. Staying home was admitting she was right, that I didn't belong in those rooms. So I put on my best dress, a simple, elegant black gown I'd bought with my own hard-earned money. I looked at myself in the mirror, And this time, I didn't see the defeated woman from 2 years ago. I saw a survivor. I saw Catherine, not Kate Dalton. Just Catherine. And she was enough. I almost didn't go. But something told me that if I stayed home that night, I'd be letting Margaret win forever. I had no idea that walking through those ballroom doors was about to change everything. Part 3. The Architect of a New World. The gala was exactly as intimidating as I had feared. It was held in a massive, historic ballroom with ceilings, so high they seemed to kiss the clouds. The air hummed with the quiet confidence of the powerful and the wealthy. Chandeliers dripped crystals, champagne flutes chimed like tiny bells, and the murmur of conversation was a low, powerful thrum. For the first 20 minutes, I felt the old insecurities creeping back in. I felt like the girl with no pedigree, an intruder in a world I had been violently ejected from. I clutched my small handbag like a shield and made a beeline for a quiet corner. I was observing, trying to look purposeful, when a man next to me spoke. "If you're hiding from someone, you've chosen a terrible spot. This is directly in the path to the bar." I turned, a polite dismissal on my lips, and found myself looking into the kindest pair of eyes I had ever seen. They were a warm hazel, crinkled at the corners from smiling. He was tall, with a bit of silver at his temples that contrasted with his dark hair. He wasn't classically handsome in the way Richard had been, but he had a presence, an approachable, solid charisma that put me at ease instantly. "I'm not hiding," I said, a small smile touching my lips for the first time that night. "I'm strategizing." He chuckled, low, pleasant sound. "A fellow strategist. I'm Daniel. And my strategy is to procure 2 glasses of champagne. Can I interest you?" And just like that, the ice was broken. His name was Daniel Whitmore. We talked for what felt like hours, leaning against the marble railing of a balcony overlooking the city lights. The conversation flowed with a shocking ease. He wasn't interested in my pedigree. He was interested in my thoughts. We talked about everything: branding, ethics, terrible modern art, the overrated genius of certain film directors, our shared love for hole-in-the-wall taco joints. He was sharp, witty, and he listened, truly listened, in a way that made me feel seen and valued. He mentioned he was in family business, and I mentioned I was a brand strategist. We kept it general. The ghosts of my past made me cautious. But for the first time in years, I wasn't Catherine, the former Mrs. Dalton. I was just Kate, a woman having a fascinating conversation with a man who made her laugh. When he asked for my number at the end of the night, I gave it to him without hesitation. He texted me before I even got home. "I hope your strategic withdrawal from the party was a success. I'm already plotting our next meeting." Our first date was at one of the taco joints we'd talked about. He showed up in jeans and a nice sweater. No pretense, no airs. Our second was a walk through a modern art museum where we gleefully made fun of the same pretentious installations. He was down-to-earth, genuine, and refreshingly normal. The fact that he was clearly wealthy, he drove a nice car, he lived in a beautiful part of the city, seemed incidental to who he was as a person. With Richard, the wealth was the whole story. With Daniel, it felt like a footnote. It was about a month into our dating that the other shoe dropped. I was at his apartment, a stunning penthouse with panoramic city views. I was admiring a framed newspaper article on his wall, a feature on innovators in the tech sector. And there was his picture under the headline, "Daniel Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Enterprises, on disrupting the old guard." Whitmore Enterprises. The name hit me like a physical blow. Dalton Industries, the empire built by Richard's family, had only one true, long-standing rival. One company that consistently challenged their market dominance. One name that was spoken like a curse at the Dalton dinner table. Whitmore. My blood ran cold. The Daltons and the Whitmores had been locked in a corporate feud for 2 generations. It was the stuff of local business legend, a modern-day Montague and Capulet, but with quarterly earnings reports instead of swords. Daniel came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. "Impressive, huh?" he said, his voice warm in my ear. My grandfather would be horrified that I framed a press clipping, but I was proud of that one. I turned to face him, my heart pounding. "You're that Whitmore." He looked at me, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. "The one and only, I suppose. Why do you look like you've seen a ghost?" I had to tell him. My carefully constructed wall of privacy had to come down. I took a deep breath and the whole sordid story came tumbling out. My marriage to Richard, the cruelty of Margaret, the painful divorce, the way they had made me feel so small and insignificant. I told him my maiden name and my former, hated married name. He listened patiently, his expression shifting from curiosity to a deep, simmering anger on my behalf. When I finished, the silence in the room was heavy. I braced myself for the reaction, for him to back away, to say this was too complicated, too messy. Instead, he reached out and took my hand, his grip firm and steady. "Kate," he said, his voice low and serious. "First of all, I'm sorry you went through that. No one deserves to be treated that way." He paused, his thumb rubbing gentle circles on my knuckles. "And second, the fact that you were married to a Dalton doesn't change a single thing about how I feel about you. If anything, it makes me admire you more. You escaped. You rebuilt yourself from the ground up. You're a survivor." And then he said the words that healed a part of me I thought would be broken forever. "Their name doesn't define you. Your strength does." In that moment, I fell completely and irrevocably in love with him. Our relationship deepened. We were inseparable. With him, I felt safe. I felt cherished. He celebrated my successes. He listened to my fears, and he never, ever made me feel like I was anything less than his equal. He met my friends, who adored him. I met his family, a warm, boisterous group who welcomed me with open arms, asking about my work and my passions, not my bloodline. Being with the Whitmores was like stepping into the light after years in a dark room. This was what family was supposed to feel like. That a year after we met at the gala, on a trip to the coast, Daniel proposed. We were walking on the beach at sunset, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink. He didn't make a grand speech. He just turned to me, his eyes full of a sincere, overwhelming love, and said, "Kate, my life was in black and white before I met you. You brought the color. I don't want to spend a single day without you in it. Will you marry me?" I said yes through a flood of happy tears. It wasn't about his name or his money. It was about him. It was about the man who saw the real me, the person I was when all the titles and baggage were stripped away. We decided to announce our engagement in a joint feature in a prominent business journal, a modern move for a modern couple. It was a story about the merging of two minds, a strategist and a CEO. The story focused on our shared vision for the future, with a small, personal section about our engagement. We didn't mention the Dalton connection. We didn't have to. Anyone in their world would know exactly who Catherine Sterling, formerly Dalton, was. The planning wasn't for revenge. The planning was for our life. But as we worked with the journalist, as we scheduled the photo shoot, a quiet, thrilling sense of anticipation began to build inside me. This wasn't a direct attack. It was better. It was the simple, irrefutable fact of my happiness, my success, my new life. It was a truth that I was no longer a footnote in the Dalton saga, but the protagonist of my own. The article was scheduled to be published online at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday. The night before, Daniel and I ordered takeout and sat on the floor of his apartment, poring over blueprints for the home we were going to build. He looked up at me, a knowing smile on his face. "Ready for tomorrow?" I smiled back, a genuine, unburdened smile. "I'm ready for the rest of my life." The announcement went live at 9 a.m. I could almost feel the shockwave travel across the city, all the way to Margaret's marble-floored mansion. It wasn't a declaration of war. It was a declaration of victory. The game had just changed, and she didn't even know she was playing.
Part 4. The balance sheet of happiness. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. My phone began to buzz with texts from old friends and former colleagues, a chorus of "congratulations" and "oh my God." The business journal's website nearly crashed from the traffic. The story was everywhere. It wasn't just society gossip. It was a seismic event in the city's corporate landscape. "Whitmore heir to wed former Dalton," the headlines screamed. They framed it as a Romeo and Juliet story for the boardroom, a shocking union of rival houses. But they all missed the real story. This wasn't about the union of two companies. It was about the vindication of one person, me. Daniel and I had anticipated the media frenzy. His PR team handled the official statements, a calm, professional front that gave the gossip mill nothing more to chew on. But I knew the real reaction, the one that truly mattered, wouldn't be in a press release. It would be in the tightening of a jaw, the flicker of panic in a pair of pale blue eyes. The first direct confirmation of Margaret's reaction came from an unexpected source, Richard's sister, Clara. She and I had always had a civil, if distant, relationship. She called me the afternoon the news broke. Her voice was a mixture of shock and, to my surprise, admiration. "Kate, it's Clara," she began, sounding hesitant. I just wanted to say congratulations. Truly. Thank you, Clara. That's kind of you. There was a pause, and then she let out a short, sharp laugh. You have no idea what you've done. I've never seen Mother like this. She's been pacing in the library for 3 hours. She shattered a porcelain bird. A bird. She lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. She keeps muttering, "That little nobody. How dare she?" Kate, you've done what an entire board of directors and a legion of corporate raiders couldn't do in 30 years. You've terrified her. Hearing those words sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated triumph through me. Not because I had caused her pain, but because I had finally broken through her armor of condescending indifference. I was no longer of no consequence. I was a threat. The true moment of reckoning, however, came a few weeks later. Daniel and I were attending a fundraiser at the City Art Museum. It was our first public appearance as an engaged couple, and we knew the Daltons would be there. They couldn't afford not to be. It would look like they were hiding. Walking into that crowded hall on Daniel's arm was a profoundly different experience from every other time I had entered such a room. I wasn't Richard's little project. I wasn't the out-of-place daughter-in-law. I was Daniel Whitmore's fiancée. People who used to look through me were now flocking to congratulate us. The respect in their eyes was palpable, and it was directed at me as much as it was at him. Then I saw her. Margaret, standing near the grand staircase, a glass of champagne in her hand, looking as impeccable as ever. But I saw what others might have missed. I saw the slight, rigid set of her shoulders, the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, the tightness around her mouth. She was holding court, but her gaze kept darting towards us. Our eyes met across the room. For a brief, electrifying moment, the polite chatter and music faded away. It was just the two of us. I didn't glare. I didn't sneer. I simply held her gaze, and I smiled. A real, genuine smile. The smile of a woman who was happy, who was loved, and who was, in every sense of the word, winning. In her eyes, I saw it all: rage, disbelief, and the cold, dawning horror of having been so completely and utterly outmaneuvered. She had played a game of social chess, and I had flipped the entire board over by simply choosing to play a different game altogether. She broke eye contact first, turning sharply to one of her friends. Later that evening, our paths finally crossed. Daniel and I were talking to the museum director when Margaret, Richard, and his father approached. There was no avoiding it. The air grew thick with unspoken history. "Daniel," Arthur Dalton said, extending a hand with forced cordiality. "Congratulations to you both." "Arthur, thank you," Daniel said, his tone perfectly pleasant, though his arm tightened protectively around my waist. Richard wouldn't look at me. He just mumbled a "Hello, Kate," his eyes fixed on a point somewhere over my shoulder. He looked smaller than I remembered, diminished. And then, Margaret. She turned to me, her face a perfect, porcelain mask. "Catherine," she said, the single word layered with a decade's worth of condescension. "You've done very well for yourself." The insult was clear, tucked neatly inside the compliment. The implication that my entire journey, my entire relationship with Daniel, had been a calculated social climb. The old me would have shrunk. The old me would have stammered or flushed with anger. But the new me simply smiled. I'm very happy, Margaret. Thank you. There was nothing more to say. My happiness was the one thing she couldn't dismiss, couldn't critique, couldn't reframe. It was a solid, undeniable fact, and it was my shield and my sword. We exchanged a few more meaningless pleasantries, and then they moved on, leaving a wake of cold air behind them. Daniel leaned down, his lips close to my ear. Are you okay? I'm better than okay, I whispered back, feeling a profound sense of release. It's finally over. Our wedding was everything my first wedding wasn't. It wasn't a stuffy, formal affair designed to impress the Dalton social circle. It was a celebration, held at the Whitmore family's beautiful lakeside estate. It was filled with light, with laughter, with friends who genuinely loved us, and with a family that had embraced me as their own. I wore a stunning custom-designed dress, and as I walked down the aisle towards Daniel, I felt a sense of peace so deep it felt like it had settled into my very bones. The Daltons were there. They had to be. To decline would have been a public admission of defeat. I saw them in the third row, Margaret in a severe steel-gray dress, her face like a thundercloud. Richard, looking lost and uncomfortable. They were guests at my life, forced to bear witness to the glorious, triumphant next chapter that they had no part in. They had to watch as the girl with no pedigree married into a family more powerful and more respected than their own. They had to listen to the heartfelt toasts about my intelligence, my kindness, my strength. They had to watch me dance with my new husband, a man who looked at me with an adoration Richard had never been capable of. Every smile I shared with Daniel, every laugh with my new family, every congratulatory hug from a captain of industry was, I knew, a fresh torment for her. She had tried to write my story, casting me as a minor, tragic character. And now she was forced to sit in the audience and watch me direct my own magnificent epic, and why revenge was never a plot. It wasn't a scheme I concocted in a dark room. It was built day by day in the light. It was in the extra hours I put in at work. It was in the courage it took to walk into a networking event alone. It was in the vulnerability of opening my heart again. It was in saying yes to a man who valued my mind more than my background.
The balance finally shifted, not on my wedding day, but in all the quiet moments that led to it. And it continues to shift. Every time Dalton Industries posts a disappointing quarter while Whitmore Enterprises soars, I know Margaret sees my face. Every time a magazine mentions the Whitmore power couple, I know she has to read my name. The name she tried so hard to erase, now linked forever to her greatest rival. I didn't need sharp words or vengeful acts. The justice I found was far more complete. It's in the warmth of Daniel's hand in mine as we read the morning paper. It's in the respect I command in a boardroom. It's in the quiet, unshakable knowledge that I am not, and never was, a girl with no pedigree. I am the architect of my own life, the founder of my own dynasty of happiness. Margaret wanted to save the family name. But in the end, I was the one who built an empire she could never touch. And living inside its beautiful, unbreachable walls is the sweetest justice of all. The best revenge isn't loud and explosive. Sometimes, it's the quiet, inevitable tide of karma. What did you think of Kate's story? Was her success the perfect response to her humiliation? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. I read every single one. And if you found this story as satisfying as I did, please don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story of justice served. Thank you for listening.